Ecology, Chapter 48, Part 2. So let's talk about biogeochemical cycles. These should be reviewed from junior high. You should have seen some of them before. But let's just break down this word bio, life. So how does life interact with these things? So we have life, geo, meaning basically the earth, chemical, then the chemicals behind the earth here and how we can change those back and forth into different substances as needed for life. So the first cycle, let's just talk about the basis of these cycles, whether they're open or closed. Now, energy is an open system since light does come into our planet from the sun. But when we talk about chemicals, that means basically the actual matter on our planet, it's closed. So we have the same amount of carbon on our planet today as we had 100 million years ago, and we'll have in 100 million years in the future. So those materials don't really leave or enter our planet. We do get some additional materials with asteroids, but again, the amount that we get from outside our planet is really small. So the biogeochemical cycles, they involve biotic and abiotic components. We're going to talk about gaseous forms like carbon dioxide, oxygen, sulfur, and nitrogen. And more of, you could say a solid, or I guess a solid would be the best term, forms that we find in soils. So we talk about phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and other elements. I have a picture of calcium down here. There are 4 possible reservoirs for these biochemical cycles. One is living organisms, and we've talked about transferring energy, but you're also transferring materials. So when one organism eats another organism, the materials, the matter in that organism goes into that other organism. So we can transfer some of those materials from organism to organism through our trophic levels. Also, we have fossilized deposits, so when plants or animals die, they could turn into fossils, and we end up with coal, oil, peat. We can end up getting some calcium and phosphorus reserves, especially when we talk about large marine organisms dying and falling to the bottom of the ocean and whatnot. Inorganic, that's rapid recycling in water, soil, and air. So that's stuff that's available. So we know that water will move within different organisms pretty quickly. Unavailable, and that's where it's tied up in rocks. So once those elements get into rocks, they're very hard to add into the ecosystem. Some examples of, I guess you could say, rocks are more like fossils or shells, so that calcium carbonate gets locked up in those shells. Phosphorus also is high in the skeletal systems. So when those animals die and the bones are left behind, those elements kind of get trapped inside those deposits. So the first cycle we're going to discuss is the water cycle. I kind of like to start at the actual source, which is the water. So we know that water will evaporate up due to the sunlight, and we know it's evaporation, and then as it goes up and it gets cooler, it will condense, and then we end up getting precipitation. Now that precipitation can do a couple things. Now we can get precipitation that's going to run down, and we've got runoff, which then goes into streams and then goes back into your lakes, which then can be evaporated up into, again, another cloud system here. And this is what the whole cycle is, and we can see how it's going to go round and round and round. We also can see where we can get water released into the atmosphere here with transpiration, some sublimation, where it's going directly from the solid state here, snow, up into a vapor or steam, gaseous state of water. So there are multiple parts to this cycle, but I think this one is pretty understandable, and one of the cycles you probably have seen several times in your science education. With the carbon cycle, it's going to parallel energy. So we know that photosynthesis uses energy and it takes in carbon dioxide. There's our carbon. But we also know then on the other side of that, part of that cycle that we have cellular respiration, which also produces energy and releases carbon dioxide. So carbon recycles quickly as plants use the CO2 out of the air, and then again, animals are going to then take that carbon and re-release it. Also, fires will take that stored carbon and replace it into the atmosphere. When it burns, it releases that carbon dioxide. Detrivores are also going to be organisms that are going to do this. They're going to take that carbon locked up in dead and decomposing materials and re-release that as carbon dioxide or methane gas. So here's a diagram of our carbon cycle, and we can see the plants taking in the carbon dioxide. And then, of course, when the leaves fall and decompose, that will get re-released back up into the atmosphere. We also have animals now that will take that carbon and eat the plants. And they're going to respire, so we're going to release the carbon dioxide out. And then the plant, of course, the goat, which is the animal, will also die eventually and produce waste that will then be released into the atmosphere. Plants also have mitochondria, so they are also going to respire. And then, of course, we have us humans that do additional burning of those carbon materials to release that back up into the atmosphere. There's also a whole nother cycle in the ocean. Oceans are able to take in carbon dioxide and also to release it back into the atmosphere. And we'll talk a little bit about that more when we talk about the history of our planet, and maybe a little bit more when we get into marine environments. So we're talking about the carbon cycle. We also know that, like we had mentioned earlier, combustion, so catching things on fire releases that CO2. So when we have wood, fossil fuels, and even some shells, they can then recycle or put that unusable form of carbon into a usable form. The air is a repository for most of our CO2, so that's where we're going to see most of it. You say it's available. The ocean also holds CO2 in a form known as bicarbonate, and that acts as a buffer to prevent the pH of the ocean from changing dramatically. CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere fluctuate based on season. If you look at a picture of the world, so you look at a globe, you can see that there are definitely more land in the northern hemisphere than the southern hemisphere. So you can think about how this would affect carbon dioxide levels, especially in the different seasons. So in the summer season in the northern hemisphere, you have a lot of photosynthesis going on, and you're taking some of that CO2 out of the atmosphere, versus in the winter time when plants have lost their leaves, they're dormant. We're not going to be taking all that CO2 out of the atmosphere. Now, of course, the southern hemisphere will be, but like we just said, there's less land available. So there's always been this balance between production of carbon dioxide and use of carbon dioxide, but today we have too much carbon dioxide being produced. We've seen an increase of 200 parts per million in 20 years. This is a problem because what we're finding is that rainforest destruction. Remember, rainforests are going to help to take that CO2, that excess CO2 out of the atmosphere and fix it into a usable form. And so what happens is we also have this excess CO2 that's going to go into the ocean, and it's going to have an effect on pH. And we have noticed that the pH is at their lowest levels they've been in, as far as we've been able to record it. So this is a problem. This might be a problem related to the coral reefs dying or other organisms in the marine environment really struggling for survival right now. So with all this extra CO2, the question is, we know that carbon dioxide it's a greenhouse gas. And what we talk about with the greenhouse gases help to keep the planet warmer. The sunlight gets into the it penetrates the atmosphere of the earth, but once it hits the ground, it changes frequency. It loses some of that energy, and the wavelength of that solar radiation now cannot escape the planet with the greenhouse gases. So for the longest time, you've been hearing them cry, global warming, we're the cause of global warming. And we've done a lot of things to help prevent and lower the carbon dioxide rate. But now climatologists are throwing out this term global cooling. And this is kind of a change in this trend. So it's going to be interesting how this plays out. They're saying now we're going to go through a period of global cooling, potentially through the halfway through this millennium. So you can enjoy these polar vortexes that we have coming down and giving us -6 degrees without wind chill in northern Illinois. This might be normal for the next 20, 30 years. So when we talk about the nitrogen cycle, we find that 78% of our atmosphere is actually made up of nitrogen, but it's worthless, or what I should say, unusable to most species. We need to be able to get that nitrogen converted in order to make amino acids, which then will make the proteins. But most of the atmospheric nitrogen we find as N2, which is 2 nitrogen atoms triple bonded to each other, which is very difficult to break. Now, plants require nitrate, which is NO3 negative, and so we need to be able to take that N2 and convert it into a usable form. We've talked about fixing other types of elements, like for instance, carbon, and we talked about taking that unusable form, that carbon dioxide, and fixing it into a usable form where we take RUBP, and it helps to fix that carbon dioxide into the Calvin cycle, which then that makes a 3-carbon sugar. And in the nitrogen cycle, what we're going to do is we're going to take that unusable form of nitrogen and fix it into usable forms of nitrogen. So we can get this from 3 sources. So the first is called ammonification, and that's what we're going to take into using organic compounds that are decomposed by bacteria into ammonium, so NH4+. Plants cannot directly use this. So again, we're going to take organic compounds that are broken down by bacteria, and we're going to make our NH4. That's the first step. Now the second is called nitrification. Now the ammonium is converted by bacteria first into nitrite and then into nitrates. So if any of you are aquarium enthusiasts, you know that when you're checking your water levels for different potential problems in your freshwater tanks, you have to check for ammonia, you have to check for nitrites and nitrates. So there's 3 different tests for these products, these byproducts of fish. So we have the ammonium, we have the nitrites, and then we have the nitrates. So the nitrates can then be used by the plants to make protein. So this is the one we want to get to. We want to get to nitrates. So when we talk about nitrogen fixation, that's the ability that some bacteria have in the soil. They're associated with roots of legumes, which can then convert nitrogen gas directly into ammonium. So we're going to take that unusable form of nitrogen and turn it into a usable form of our ammonium. So this again is a form of nitrogen fixation, and so we find this mutualistic relationship here. The plant is going to provide a home for the bacterial cells and food, and in return the bacterial cells then will fix nitrogen for them. Now when we look at denitrification, that is the opposite. So another type of bacteria can then reverse the process and take that ammonium and convert it into nitrogen gas, atmospheric nitrogen. These are generally anaerobic bacteria that do not require oxygen. So we find these bacteria in soggy soils, and when we have that soggy soil in that environment, so again we're going to go opposite here, so we're denitrification, the denitrification process. It generally reduces the fertility of the soil, and so what we find is these are generally found like in bog areas, And we've mentioned how certain types of plants, especially our carnivorous plants, do quite well there because they obtain nitrogen from another source because they're not going to get it from the soil. So here's a picture of the nitrogen cycle, and we can see that we have natural processes, which is like rainfall. Lightning will fix nitrogen, so then that nitrogen will then come down with the rain with those nice thunderstorms. We also have atmospheric nitrogen being fixed by symbiotic relationships, so bacteria. And then, of course, then we have man-made fertilizers where we have processed, usually, we could say fecal matter, and that we put into the ground to help fertilize our plants. So here's a totally natural one here with the manure. So these are all the way your plant residue, so it's kind of like coming off from by fertilizing or even from those symbiotic bacteria in the roots, although we find them in legumes, not so much as corn. So those are all ways that we put nitrogen, we fix it, and we take it from an unusable to a usable form. And then in the soil, we notice we have all of our bacterial cells that are converting it from the ammonia to the nitrates, so that the plants can then totally take those up in the roots. And we have leaching. Well, leaching just means it goes into the soil. And then we need to also have ways to now put it back into the atmosphere so we can release that here from, of course, the odor and whatnot from the fumes or the byproducts of animals. And then here the ventilation from the plants here that, I don't want to say plants as in green plants, but the fertilizer plants here. And then we also have bacterial cells that will denitrification. Remember we talked about denitrification, and that will release that back up into we got it right here, into the atmosphere. So let's move on to the phosphorus cycle. The phosphorus, we've seen it used in nucleic acids, ATP, bones, and teeth. It's a simple cycle that does not involve atmospheric phosphates. They are from rock. Very important for productivity and can overstimulate productivity in lakes when there is runoff. Decomposition also releases phosphates, this is especially fast in the tropics. So here's a picture of the phosphorus cycle, and what we can see here is if we start here with water, that's going to run over rocks and start to wear them down and release some of that phosphorus, which will then go into the lake. The lake will then, we're going to use that phosphorus and incorporate that into our primary producers, or algae and plants, and then of course they get eaten, and so it moves into the food webs through that primary producer. When the fish dies and decomposes, then it can either be released or entered into that food chain, or it'll form what's called sedimentary rocks. Over time, that sedimentary rock will then surface, and it'll start that over again. Again, we're talking millions of years here. Another way is we put phosphate, so here phosphate mining, actually looking for that sedimentary rock, grinding that up, and then putting that into a type of fertilizer that we put on our crops. And that's a big problem we have up here in northern Illinois, where we have lots of crops. And we fertilize them, and then the excess fertilizer runs off into the rivers and streams around here, and then lakes. We also have, again, we're going to have phosphates in the soil, which will be used by the plants, which get eaten by the animals, and then the animal waste will also contain those phosphates, which again, as runoff, will go into the local body of water. What happens when your phosphate levels get very high? Plants really do well in a high phosphate environment, and so your plants will grow out of control, and we actually get these things called algal blooms. We'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about eutrophication. So let's talk a little bit more about human interactions and a process known as biological magnification. And this is where poisons are introduced into the food web, and we see the amount of those poisons increase as they move up through the food chain. Some examples are PCB, mercury, and DDT. So in this picture we can see with DDT, which used to be a pesticide they used, they were trying to get rid of mosquitoes. And what we found is, although there were very small amounts in the water, they would then be taken in up into the zooplankton. And notice how when we go up each level, notice the concentration of DDT increases. We found that this is a lipid-soluble pesticide, and so it accumulates in the fatty tissue. So by the time we got up to the predatory birds, it was up to 25 parts per million. Now, what happened because of DDT is that when these predatory birds would then lay their eggs, this pesticide interfered with the ability for those shells on the eggs to be made properly. And so when the parents would go to sit on their eggs to incubate them, they would crush under the pressure of the adults. So we found many of our predatory birds were dying from this pesticide, which is no longer used in the U.S. So another thing that we're responsible is for the tear down or breakdown or damage that we've done to the ozone layer. Ozone is 3 oxygen molecules that's found up in our atmosphere, and the job of ozone is to filter out UV light. Now, chlorofluorocarbons, or CFC, used to be used in our refrigerants or anything that was like a aerosol type material. And what we found was that once that CFC got up into our atmosphere, it actually it broke down the O3 into O2. The situation was by far worse in the poles. If you watch that video that I had on there for you, it talked about how it's really influences the areas that have the very cold air up in the high altitudes. So we have found that the mid-latitudes have lost 2 to 10% of the ozone over the last 20 years. So here's just a quick diagram here showing you how ozone is made and broken down. Now, you need a couple of things in order to make ozone. One, you need a molecule of oxygen, and you need sunlight. That solar radiation will split apart a molecule of oxygen into an atom, and then that atom will hook up with a molecule and will go from O2 then to O3. Of course, when we put the CFCs in there, it reverses this process, and we end up getting O2, and we'll take off an oxygen. So we'll break it down. Wasn't a very good oxygen. All right. So in this diagram, you can see by the colors how the ozone layer has been affected. The purple is like the least amount of ozone. The dark blue, and you can see this little right there diagram here, how these are the low numbers, and we want to have high numbers. And we see we've got some good spots right here and here, but we always talk about this big huge hole in the ozone down in the Antarctica, and you can see it here. Now we are noticing that the ozone layer is getting better down here. We've lost some of the purple, and we're going towards the blue, which is good, and eventually hopefully we'll go lighter blue, and then we'll get back to green. I would like you to watch this video. Now, I know it doesn't work on this style of presentation, but go into Canvas, go to this page on the teacher's lecture, and click on there, and there's a really nice little video on the ozone layer. So again, when we're talking about human impact, what impact does having a thinner ozone layer have? Well, now we have increased solar radiation, especially that UV light hitting the surface of our planet. And we have seen this in the increase in skin cancer in humans. We also have noticed that it may be killing many of the decomposers And we are speculating that it might take up to 100 years for this to recover. Like I said, we think we are on the path of recovery, but it's going to take some time to restore the amount of ozone that we destroyed using chemicals in the atmosphere. This ends the presentation for chapter 48, and hopefully you have read the chapter. If not, be sure to read and make notes for your test, and then we're going to start 49.